Welcome to our lecture today on Taoism. It's spelled Taoism with the T, sometimes Daoism with the D. It kind of depends on the history of Chinese transliteration. As you know, Chinese was written in a non-phonetic sort of ideograph style. But then there's a type of transliteration or writing down how a thing sounds called pinyin. It's that pinyin is like sort of a written form of how Chinese sounds. As that even further gets transliterated or made into Roman characters or English letters, if you will, then you see that T's and D's are different. We find this actually, that I find this in a number of languages, that D's and T's, and if you go in your mouth, dot and tot are really close. So they get switched around in a lot of languages. Also was and buzz, of course. And then ki and chi, which you can also hear as well in your mouth as you say it out loud. Okay, so let's get started. So there is remarkable little study on the, like surprisingly little study on the actual practices of Taoist priests and Taoist lay folks. It's like ethnographers just haven't gotten to get a lot of access to that. There's a good reason for that. During the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese communists sort of outlawed all religions, so all the religions went into private and into secret. And since the 1980s, Taoism has made a comeback, but we lost a lot during that period of communist rule. And even now, a lot of people are still really secretive about their Taoist practices. So it's going to be a while for the anthropologists to really catch up and figure out what people are actually doing out there. But we do have a lot of scriptural study. Of course, because it doesn't matter what's going on in China, you just learn Chinese and then you read it. So that's the nature of one of the reasons why we don't have a lot of sort of good studies of the ethnography, the study of the culture of Taoist practitioners. So, but the other thing is there is a lot of discourse on Taoist scripture and philosophy, as I said before. And the other thing I wanted to make this point about is that Chinese folk, including the Chinese government these days, has marketed Taoism to the West in a very specific way. So you see description of Taoist philosophy, Taoist medicine, acupuncture, and all of the like. Medicine that does overlap with alchemy, so preparing sort of medicinal substances. And also it's just sort of like kooky, weird Taoist stuff. So what we do see here is that the way, and of course the martial arts, these are ways that Taoism is presented in the West. We very rarely hear discussion of hereditary temples or people doing exorcisms or whatnot, which would have been a big part of Taoism, especially before, when it was still in the imperial period before 1911. So in China today, conservative estimates say that there are 13% of Chinese people are Taoist followers, and there are 12 million initiates. So people who are Taoist priests or some sort of professional Taoist. On this, I kind of want you to think about how this works out. So when they did the census, it basically said, do you consider yourself a follower of Taoism? Who knows what that means? So there is a distinction between people who follow Taoism and are not priests. And then there would be Taoist priests. And then there would also be people that could be of any other religious tradition, including sort of the folk traditions, that would also occasionally go to a Taoist priest or a Taoist temple and sort of respect Taoism in one way or another. So there are a couple of paradigms for clergymen, and there were female clergy that, when we have records of that throughout the different dynasties, of there being female Taoist priests. I don't have any good knowledge of them right at the moment. So the word for a Taoist priest is Daoshi. So a Taoist priest, a professional. So a Daoshi is any of the following that we're going to talk about below. Then you have the Shen, who these were monastics. They were very much like Buddhist monks. So they would live in monasteries, whether that's urban or rural. They would live kind of specific types of life. They would be celibate, so they would not be married, and they were usually vegetarian. So these are not necessarily hermits because they're still kind of living in a monastic community. And for my money, this idea of the Shen priests in these monasteries was derived from the Buddhist influence since the Buddhists came in the 2nd century and then really started pouring in the 4th. Then you have the Zengi, who would probably be the vast majority of Buddhist priests. They were married. They lived in their own homes. They were often part-time working in the temple. They had other jobs. They might have even founded their own small temple in the neighborhood themselves. And these temples would be dedicated to everything from from Taoist masters who had transcended the world but still could come back and give revelations. Or so sort of the divinized dead. Of course, they would argue that they didn't necessarily die; they just transcended the world. Or to Taoist gods, most of whom, when you really dig down, were originally human. So these would have been hereditary, so father to son for the most part. And the other thing is we see toward the end of the Han period, you see the way of the celestial masters. These were the sort of like, this is the paradigm for the Taoist, was working towards personal transcendence and immortality, and great longevity and immortality. Of course, no one's immortal, but you know, you can die and become divinized. And people can have this idea, like you come back and interact with them and give them more scripture. So this was called the Way of the Celestial Masters. Comes at the end of the Han period, then was powerful and prominent during the 6 dynasties, or after the Han. And in this time period, you would have these sort of ideal Taoist kind of supermen, if you will. So the types of practices that they do in either of these paradigms depends on the scriptures that they follow. So there is a strong appeal throughout this to the Taoist scriptures. And as I said before, the Taoists they were often just in general, were often hereditary. I mean, they couldn't be if they were celibate, obviously. But they had these philosophical ideals. They also use very high Chinese literature. This is a high-end elite tradition. This is not just, you know, the way of all folk. Also, these guys aren't hermits. We'll talk about more like that. They're living in communities or living with their families. The other thing is, it appears that probably the Guanzhen are going to be much more rural, and the Zengyi are going to be more urban, though that's not always the case, because you can have an urban monastery. Okay, so let's map out another set of paradigms that I think is really helpful for understanding who these clergy folks are. So you have 2 paradigms. One, you have the hermit, and the other who is the priest or scholar, or the priest, scholar, or sage. I have say written there for some reason. The priest, scholar, sage. So the priest, scholar, sages are going to be the guys we were talking about before. So then our other argument is going to be, you have the hermits. Hermits are not necessarily celibate, but they would be very highly sexually regulated. They have very highly restricted diet as well. They're cultivating inner meditative experiences and meditation. They lived in a hermitage, or a place set outside of sort of society. I know when I visit the monastery I go to often, which is a Catholic monastery in Albuquerque, they have a hermitage, which is where one of the fathers built a house away from all the other guys, and he pretty much lived as a hermit. Of course, my buddy Father Stephen always says, you're not a hermit if you go to the movies on Saturday and watch the football game on Sunday. If you're going to be a hermit, stop coming to dinner every night. So there was some tension with that hermit. I found it really quite amusing. Anyway, so the hermit lives outside of society, which is ideal in this, like, sort of, if we think of our earliest form of Buddhist or of Taoist idealism, which is you should get outside of society. You should become like the uncut stone, perfectly balanced in nature, not marred by civilization in any way. So these guys live out in the country. They're kind of wild and natural, sort of wild man types, and their aims were to transcend not only society, but to transcend the world. And the best way to become more natural and transcend the world would be to get out of society. Now, our priest, our scholar, our sage, these guys live in the temples, sometimes live in the temple and sometimes work in temples. They live in the city. Some are associated with dynasties, and in the Ming dynasty from 1368 to 1644, this was a long-standing dynasty. It's one of the more famous dynasties. A lot of Westerners have heard of it. Their Taoism and Buddhism were the official religions. So at that point, all the Taoist ideals from before could be out and people could practice in public. So from 1368 to 1644 was in many ways sort of a heyday of Taoist thinking and Taoist practice. So what do these people do, these priests, scholars, and sages? Well, they do rituals for other people and for themselves. They practice medicine, probably also martial arts, and also various services such as exorcism, divination. So when they're in their temple, people could come to them and have some of these services done for them. So what are the practices of these Taoists? Well, food sacrifice, or offering foods, usually fruits and fruits, oils, uncut fruits, of course, uncut flowers. You'll notice this in a lot of traditions when people are doing offerings. They'll be like, you know, a banana that is not cut, an orange that is uncut. It's really important that they're uncut and that they're whole and they're not cooked. So here we have food sacrifices. Now, once upon a time in the earliest forms of Buddhism, there were animal sacrifices, but that became restricted and they've never come back. So people still do not do animal sacrifices, though they will offer cooked meat, I'm pretty sure. So what other practices are there? Well, you also have the burning of hell money. So I see this in some Buddhist cultures as well, but it's the idea that you have like money that's printed out on cheap paper, so it's not real money, and you burn it up and it helps the ancestors and it's good luck all around. They would oversee and organize street parades. They would oversee festival rituals. So if you appeal to Taoist cultures and Taoist priests, you're going to have them oversee these types of regular practices that people do. Also, what's really interesting to me is they have various forms of divination. The most interesting to me is planchette writing or spirit writing. Now, if you've ever seen a Ouija board, the little thing that you put your two fingers on and go around on the board, that's called a planchette. Originally in the West, they were made with empty decks of cards that someone would put a pin in the card, and that would be their planchette. Well, these Taoists had a similar idea of using planchettes with pens and whatnot to do spirit writing to contact spirits. Other obvious things include medicine. I mean, remember these Taoists were connected to alchemy, and you have alchemy that makes a man into a god man, lead into gold, but also is the firmament for understanding chemical interventions in medicine. So a lot of our ideas about medicine do come out of early alchemy, to the point that most people think of alchemy as about turning lead into gold, but it was more about medical interventions to create longevity and possible immortality in humans. Also, acupuncture comes from kind of the Taoist thing, and that's what a lot of Taoist priests would perform. They'd also use yoga type practices. The word yoga type comes up all the time in this writing. You know, these have nothing to do with yoga, whether it's the bending of the body, or yoga and it's Sankhya that we discussed before, and the separation of Purusha and Prakriti. But they do, you know, various like bend your body in this way and breathe in certain manners and regulate the chi within the body through your body thing and whatnot. So it looks like yoga. It's not connected to yoga, and it's not yoga. And also the martial arts. Okay, so what are some ideals and some tensions that we find? So these ideals, these various ideals and paradigms that I've given are productive. They help to understand how Taoism developed from its founding to the end of its sort of development at the end of Imperial China in 1911. So, and before the Common Era, we see that these tensions, like such as, you know, such as the tension between being sort of like a genuine religious person living in a hermitage, religious, or being a monk living in some sort of a monastery, that creates a tension. And from tensions and conflicts like that, religions tend to become much more interesting. They drive one another. Those tensions work to make things more interesting. So what are some of those tensions? So one of the big ones I've argued here is religious versus monastic. So someone who's a monk or a priest or whatnot versus someone who lives in a hermitage and does their own practice. You have liturgical versus philosophical. So are you contemplating the nature of the Tao and the empty mind, clear space, whatnot? Or are you doing specific rituals that get a soul and a body sort of in line with the Tao? Those are two different types of practice. And odds are it's not that anybody goes one or the other. It's that they play off each other, and practitioners take different versions of that at different times. Other kind of weirdnesses that we see is this sort of marketing of Taoism in the West as all philosophy with an emphasis on practical medicine and the martial arts. So that's completely non-ritual, doesn't have to do with divine Taoist revelations or divine Taoist perfected people that folk worship. All that's removed, even though I would argue that's the key part of Taoism, what makes Taoism really interesting. And it's removed for a philosophy that my argument would be probably most Taoists don't really know very well. And specific forms of medicine, which would be parts of priests without the religion. And then the martial arts, which, you know, it's neither here nor there. So our version of Taoism in the West creates a tension, yet another tension. So I would say as Taoism is reestablished in the 21st century now, it will be a part of Taoists actually looking at the way Taoism has been understood in the West, and this is understood by Chinese people, that they are understood and the religion is understood in a very specific way, and them deciding to either go with that or reform it to be more traditionally what they had in the past. There is sort of a problem, and that we could really use a long-standing and long-ranging study of ritual and Taoism, but I haven't really found it yet. Little has been done to connect the philosophy and the ritual and show how they really connect. So I think this is either due to the way that ritual exponents explain their work to Westerners, and we're like, oh, you guys like this stuff? I'll do it that way. And the fact that most people who are trying to understand Taoism these days look primarily at sort of scriptures and text. Okay, so let's talk about the history of early Taoism. And from this, I'm pulling out of Roth for today. So the history of Taoism is really in sort of like 3 phases. And these 3 phases can be separated out when we look into the early Taoist scriptures, sort of the scriptures of the early cultivation, the inner cultivation. Okay, so the theme is that more interior or individual practices develop. So the early, well, let me just say this more clearly, sorry. In the earliest version of Taoism, I'm talking about way like 6th century, it's like purely like interior practices. It has nothing to, and individual practice. It has nothing to do with the state and society and whatnot. Nothing to do with all that Confucian stuff. Then you start to see people that are like, okay, well, we'll do some of that, but we'll orient it in a way that's more for like small society. And then finally you get Taoism as it looks like today, where you, or as it looks out throughout time, where you have the inner cultivation ideals that are sort of supported by kings. And that all of the social stuff that you would see in like a Confucian text is also found in Taoist text. So let's go through this in a little more detail. So Zhang Zao in the 4th century BCE is a writer associated with the earliest form of Taoism, who's thought to be a contemporary, or maybe just a little bit later than Confucius. And in his writing, you have cosmology, so the nature of the universe, and then practices about inner transformation, likely union of inner and outer. It's very individual. It's involving like sort of mystic knowledge, mystic gnosis. Remember that word gnosis that I said before, same root as knowledge. So a knowledge vision that allows one to change one's state in the world. But it's also mystical, so it's drawing from union with the divine. It's not social, it's not political. Well, after Zhang Zhu comes Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching. He's a semi-historical figure. We don't think he actually wrote a lot of the scriptures that he did. They were probably a composite of many different scriptures that finally somebody probably a little bit later towards the 2nd century CE would have been like, oh, yeah, it's all Lao Tzu. That's common in the way that scripture development. So he argued for some connections to these social, or to these interior cultivations we saw before with Zhang Zhu, but he was also a primitivist. So what he argued was that we needed to withdraw, not necessarily completely back to nature, but to the world of small agricultural communities. Finally, after him comes the Syncretic Text. These are later, they're sort of coming into the time and toward the end of the Han. You see that there's a bunch of texts and authors who can't really separate them out. And self-transformation is still there, just as much as in the other 2, but it's connected to politics and rule and social situations. So in this sense, the rulers would have had that inner ideal of self-cultivation that is thought to guide them in their work as rulers and politicians. So in here, we see that they're not only pulling from ideas in Confucianism, but they're reacting to Confucianism and creating a new form of the ideas that Confucians say, but with a Taoist model upon it. And this syncretic sort of era of early Taoism is not identical, but it's the most similar to what we see in Taoism today. So let's deal with some of the technical vocabulary that really comes up in this syncretic period. So we're going through some of these concepts that we've talked about before, but I want to elaborate them a little bit. So the key, or shi, or qi, is the sort of vital energy. And this always kind of reminds me of the gunas that you remember from Sankhya. You have sattvas, remember that's absolute purity. It's like clear flowing water. Rajas, action. So that's like spicy foods. And if somebody has a rajas personality, they're like always moving around. And tamas, that's like the roast beef and Miller Lite, and like dirty old potato chips, just torpid, sluggish rock. So I just want to bring back that idea for a second. But with qi, they have this idea that qi in general, a great metaphor for it, is the steam that comes off of water. So it's like that vital energy that's in water, and then when you boil it, the steam comes up and you can see that vital energy. So something that's heavy, that's a heavy or a turbid qi, is dense and dull like rock. But ethereal qi, so this refined qi, is like the inner experience of a person or the body forms of ghosts. Remember, in all of these traditions, ancestor worship is everywhere, and ghosts are everywhere. We're going to see this in folk tradition. And the thing in folk religion, but the thing about understanding ancestor traditions and ghosts, it's not just that there's ghosts that haunt us. It's that the ghosts and the ancestors live alongside us at all times. So this ethereal qi in its most vital form is called Jian. And this is sort of like the vital energy in a human being. This is the most condensed form of qi. And it's what gives us life, but it's also the sublime substrate. So to have a knowledge of Jian is to see like the glittering consciousness below all that is mind. The thing that is below, that is the essence of life within you. All right, so then you know Jin, which is sort of the locus of all experience that is literally focused in the heart. So if qi is the energy within, Shen is like your awareness, your perception. As we always put this in the mind, or the Indians would put this probably in the buddhi section, so the cognitive awareness, maybe even the ahankara, the I maker, the ego. Well, in Shen, it's really focused in the heart. Now, in this, we have to understand that awareness and sort of mental acuity and whatnot is spread throughout the body. And we're going to see that there are also gods within the body. And in just a minute, we're going to talk about the body gods. In this Shen, you see that the viscera, or all of your organs and whatnot, and your interior part, all is swirling around this Shen, this awareness that is found, that is literally found the most center in the heart. And we're also going to see, as I said before, that gods are also found in the body and in different organs. All right, so Shen. We've had this word before. Shen means sort of like the Numen, or the Numen, not the numinous, the Numen, so the most subtle way of being. Spirit, soul, psyche, from the Greek for sort of spiritual essence and mental essence. So the Shen is sort of like a numinous light that that is also the same as what we see that are as spirits, gods, ghosts, little gods, and demons. Gui Shen, the demons, Gui Shen. So all these have the same essence as the Shen that is in your body. So what you do in meditation is you're trying to cultivate the experience of seeing the Shen and understanding the Shen. So this is, like I said, it's this essential life force within you that has the same sort of same qualities and is the same spirit that a ghost is made up of. I think the Christian notion of the soul is very good here, especially the soul that lives in heaven. So if you think about who you are that goes to heaven, the version of you, the spirit body that goes to heaven, would be the same, we would guess. If there were ghosts, they would all be the same. And theoretically the same as all the angels. So what I want you to understand this is it's like a metaphysical, like soul stuff is this Shen that applies to both humans and to ghosts. And finally, the Tao. Let's go through this one more time. And I got your ideograph up here. The way, the path, the ultimate power. It's transcendent in the sense that it's beyond the world, but it's also intimate. You can experience here. But the point I wanted to make is through practice, you can become aware of the Tao that is all around us at all times, and you can also merge with the Tao. And how do we get to that? It's through these practices of inner cultivation. Now, all of these ideas are really explained well in the inner cultivation texts that are translated by Roth. And if we were in class right now, I'd be putting you in groups, and I'd be saying, all right, take out Roth, take 5 of the ideas I just said, and I'd put you in 5 groups, like, you do this, you do this, you do this, and I'd have you dig through and find good exemplary representations of that. But I just want to go through the overall ideas here. I'm going to ask you elsewhere to sort of locate these in scripture and ideas. So what are the practices? Here we get into some sort of heady stuff. So the majority of meditative practices in in Taoism is what's called apophatic. Now, here are two great words. They're from the Greek, apophatic and cataphatic. Apophatic means you're trying to get rid of all words. Cataphatic means you're trying to describe things with words. This gets extended to an apophatic experience would be one that is beyond language. Cataphatic is mediated by language. Now, in Greek philosophy, primarily Christian philosophy in Greek, they talk about the apophatic experience, where one experiences the complete nothingness in the head that gives an experience of God. Whereas cataphatic is you are like meditating on scripture and qualities of God, qualities of something in order to understand that thing and have an experience of it. So apophatic, formless meditation. Cataphatic, cataphatic would be formed meditation or structured meditation. Another good like contemporary description would be if you get one of those little apps on your phone that does a guided meditation, cataphatic. If you sit and stare at a wall until your brain goes blank, sort of a Zen practice, that would be apophatic. Now, I always like to go back to the Indian tradition, obviously, and they have an argument in the Upanishads, and one of the earlier Upanishads called Neti Neti. And Neti is it's a hybrid word of na, which is just like you'd think it was, means no, it's a negative particle, and then iti, which means that which comes around. Kind of, it's a funny little word that's a grammatical marker that you would mark it for like a quotation. So it's often translated neti neti, not this, not this. And the practice in the Upanishads is to look into the body and look into the world and say, God is not this, God is not this, God is not this, till you get to a point where there's nothing left. And at that point, and there are arguments here, a positive experience of nothingness comes out. And that nothingness is completely full. So it's the apophatic experience. So instead of meditating on the nature and qualities of nothingness to experience nothingness, you actually cultivate an experience of nothingness. Neti neti, not this, not this, not this. I mean, in my experiences with meditation, I get a lot of value on both of them, but the apophatic is the one that I tend to go toward more. And when I've spent a lot of time in mostly Hindu monasteries, some Tibetan Buddhist places, I mean, I find that while the cataphatic is easier to get into, the experiences on apophatic styles of meditation are more powerful, but they're a lot harder. So that's my practical explanation of kind of my experiences. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're having these experiences through these practices. And the Taoists are very clear that these experiences are temporary. So but when you return from the experience, it changes you. It makes you more, and it makes the sage more equanimous, more even-keeled, understanding everything. You take something away from that meditation. Now, when you talk about the ideals in Buddhism and the ideals in Hinduism and in Jainism, people are looking for a lasting meditative experience that kind of lasts forever. But I think this is much more practical. You go into meditation or doing whatever practices you're doing as a Taoist, and then you have this powerful experience. You come back to the world, but the thing that comes back is fundamentally changed from doing that. This is sort of the ideals of the Celestial Masters. Remember, the Celestial Masters were sort of this notion of, it's the most prominent Taoist school, and they worship / emulate sages who have transcended the world and become celestial masters. Whether that ideal is to become completely sort of enlightened in the world, or it is to appeal to those celestial masters for guidance. I remember they have this idea of the celestial masters can come back at any time and reveal more practices and scriptures to people who practice. But what are some practicalities of these practices? What are the techniques that people actually use? Well, first, breath control. So not really pranayama, but similar. Breath control, which sort of refines and circulates the chi, the ki. And I've talked to a bunch of people that do a lot of this. Mostly they got into it through Kung Fu. And they talk about being able to see light and breathe into areas and move through these channels, which is a common experience with sort of meditative accomplishment. Then there's the other idea that you should sort of cultivate saving and not expending your qi jing. Now the qi jing is the qi and your jing. It's that really refined version of the qi in the body. So holding on to it, not expending it in various ways, whether that's being socially distinct or keeping the mind removed from things or gathering energy within yourself, kind of like you're a Dragon Ball Z character or something. So the idea that when the qi jing is well regulated, you get really good being. You feel good. When it's not well regulated, you're imbalanced, you get sick, problems happen. The idea is that when you're well regulated, this will actually change your behavior. So you'll behave in a way that's more natural, more along the natural guidelines. And Roth explains here that these natural guidelines can be used by Li. Remember this word Li? This was the word for ritual or proper action in Confucianism. So you see some Confucian overlap. But the idea is that by these practices, one can live more spontaneously and naturally. All right, so here's an idea that I find really interesting, and we're moving to one of the other texts we study about the inner cultivation in the time of the Yellow Court. And what we're going to talk about is gods that are found in the very body. So gods living within you. Now remember when we talked about the magistrate gods, we talked about how there was the high god, the Jade King, then you have his court and his bureaucracy, then you have the city gods, who are the magistrates over the city, and then you have gods that live in the body, and those are sort of gods that live in your body and wander around and make sure they write down everything you do. But there are gods that are found within you, because we're dealing in an animistic world where there are gods all over the place. So this court of the Yellow Court, the descriptions of the Yellow Court are supposed to be really old, but we actually think they are more like 4th century, and then they become a little more popular a bit later. But they're based on the mid-4th century. They have an inner and outer vision in their sort of scriptural nature, that inner being more esoteric, more secretive, more hard to understand. Now, these practices of body guides in sort of, to understand what I was talking about before with adipophatic and cataphatic, these are going to be more, theirs are going to be more cataphatic. They're going to be more focused. The goal is to focus on and experience the very gods in your body. Now, these body gods in Taoism are one type of many, as I said before. So one cultivates an inner vision when one looks inside of themselves and has an experience of witnessing the body gods living in you, specifically in your different organs and channels without the body. So your goal is to cultivate an experience of seeing an embodiment of divinities within that are identical to the way that they are described in Scripture, and also mirror the gods that are external. So in religious studies, we talk about microcosm and macrocosm. Microcosm, often the interior vision, the little body within you. Macrocosm, the whole universe. The goal is to find that the body gods are the mirrors of the macrocosm. Now, Indian yogis, I've actually heard describe this, that when they talk about going on pilgrimage, they'll say, oh, I went down to Tamil Nadu, and then I went to Mysore, and then I went up to Rishikesh, and they describe these long pilgrimages. And you're doing it on a map, and you're like, wow, you went a really long way. And then they'll say something like the words of the Buddha says, this whole universe is in this 1 fathom form. And they'll say, yes, I've gone all these places without ever leaving this place. So in that yogic idea, you have those pilgrimage locations that are throughout the body, and they mentally, in meditation, go through and visit all of them. In the same way here, we are looking to find all the different bodies, gods, and experiencing them and seeing that they mirror the outer gods. This links the microcosm and the macrocosm. This union of micro and macro is one of the most common principles behind mysticism in the world. So a little bit more about these body gods. So the gods correspond, and there are 5 main ones, correspond to 5 viscera or organs: your liver, your heart, your spleen, your lungs, and your kidney. In particular, the cult of the Yellow Court corresponds to the spleen, which creates bile, which is yellow. The natural world meets the philosophical world. Now, there are big clusters of 5 things, like 5 phases, 5 directions: northeast, south, west, and down or up. You have 5 colors, 5 flavors, 5 sacred mountain peaks. And these correspond to the different 5 body gods that correspond to the different 5 parts of the body. Now, the picture I've got here is by Alex Gray. He's a really prominent Western American artist. And what he's really describing here is like sort of the Tibetan Buddhist vision. But he'll have all these great pictures of like people kissing, people meditating, people doing all sorts of stuff. You can see the inside of their bodies with all of their organs, but also they're lit up like chakras and the prana, the different energy channels, the nadis, they call them, and the bandhas, the locks and the streams within the body. So I like this vision, even though it's not a Chinese idea. It's more of a Tibetan and Indian idea. But I think it gets to the point that there are these gods that exist within us alongside the physical structures. There was one prominent 19th century yoga, like yoga guru, who's also a doctor. And there were all these like tantrikas talking to him about these different types of meditations to energize the chakras and move the kundalini through it and all this. And he's like, I caught up a guy last week. I couldn't find those in there. I don't think they exist. Our idea is to kind of not think like that. We want to think about how there's subtle versions of entities that live within the body other than just sort of the physical organs within us. Okay, so as to the body gods. So we move through these gods in a meditative vision, and the scriptures are less sort of meditation manuals as sort of systems to like kind of remember what to visualize and what to think of and what to discover. So they guide the memory in going through this. So these are the scriptures are like memory guides to aid the seeing and understanding of the gods. And these gods would have also had sort of a nuanced revelation and secret meanings that were refined by practice and study. So the more you locate the gods within your body, the body gods, the more you're going to interact with them, and they're going to give you visions, and you're going to have experiences, and you will come to your own stronger understandings than any scripture would say. Overall, this is what I like to call the somatization of rituals. Soma from the Greek meaning body, not soma like the sacred psychotropic drug that Vedicists consume in ritual. So the somatization of ritual. So one's doing the ritual with the body. One's seeking the gods that one would look for in pilgrimage in the body. You're going on the pilgrimage in the body. The somatization, the bodyfying. Bodyfying, yeah, I just said that. But yeah, the embodying of ritual. So what about this way of occultists, which is our last book we read, our last section we read by Berkowitz. It's a fascinating piece. It's dry, but you have to understand what it is, and it's long, but again, you have to understand what it is. So the word occultist is interesting. I use it often. In English, the occult means the hidden, the secret, the occluded, the hidden thing. So occultists in general are traders in secrets and folks who practice in secret, very much like these Taoist masters did. The Chinese term translated means black, deep purple, dark, profound, abstruse. Abstruse meaning hard to understand. What these texts actually are by Berkowitz are a body of hagiography. Now, hagiography, as we talked about before, hagio means like sacred, graphy, writing, writing about saints. So Berkowitz translates from a body of hagiography ranging from the earliest times of Taoism to the 13th century. The text itself that he's translating was compiled in 1335, but then it became really popular in the 18th century. So there's a long range of reading this text, and they were drawing from materials that could go back a really long time, or they could just say they're going back to a really long time, even though they weren't. And with hagiography, we've got to remember, this isn't history. You're not trying to get the exact ways that saints actually lived in history. You're telling stories that inspire their reverence and devotion to them. So hagiography connects with myth. Again, myth is not a false story, but it's a story that's not literally true in order to give a figurative meaning. So it's a story that does something, that does work. And the text he translates, he just calls the Record of the Occultist, which is a pretty literal translation of the Chinese. So what are these stories? Well, the stories describe the religious achievements of certain Taoist figures, but also the ideals of everything from politics to art to poetic eloquence. And when you look at the chapter titles, you'll see that the book itself is divided into these different, kind of types of Taoism. Not types of Taoism, but types of being Taoist. Everything from just describing Taoist virtue to the section that's just called Taoist. So that just gives like religious narratives, and that really explains sort of their religious accomplishments of some of these figures. Taoist political influences, Taoist transformative influences, Taoist scholarship, Taoist art, Taoist reclusion, so Taoist meditation, and Taoist like reclusion meaning to go off into the wilderness. Taoist eloquence, Taoist nature, and Taoist efflorescence, so Taoist sort of mystical presence. The point is, we've got a story. A set of stories. Actually, I think he says there's something like, in the original text, there's like over 150 stories about these different characters throughout the history of Taoism. And he goes through and he translates and sort of highlights something. And if you go through, you just read it random, you get an idea of what the ideals of these Taoists could be, especially from the perspective of someone in the 1300s trying to think about the ideal of a Taoist life or a Taoist figure. All right, so as we read Taoist studies and sources, we must understand the varied tensions in that tradition. And I want to think about these tensions being the same themes that drive religious development in other religious groups. So think about the nature and the natural versus society and the constructed. You know, I think essentially in most Indian religions, religious experience is constructed. Get your head straight. Do Buddhism. Think like yoga. Think like Jainism. Think like Sankhya. Confucianism. You can act this way. Taoism, when it's philosophical, yes, you must find your way to being to the uncut, clear stone of the Tao. But you're going to do it through these techniques that I lay out. Versus, you know, so that's society and constructed, versus going out in nature and have the free form emptiness sort of experience. I like to think of this also as Christ going into the wilderness. What was he doing for 30 days? I like to think he was blanking his head out and just experiencing divinity fully in himself and through the world. But, you know, theologians will argue with me. Also think about the political versus the isolated. Does one as a religious figure go, screw this, I'm not getting involved with kings and courts? Or does one say, no, I got this. I'm getting involved in kings and courts because I know how to do this better and I can get these people to be converted and maybe spread my message. What about the clergy versus the hermit? Somebody who's a city monk, who attends the needs of the laity, who works with priests, who does the services, versus living out in a hermitage, not talking to anybody, just doing your religious practices and working on your own inner cultivation. And a lot of the hermits would say, I would never get anywhere. And I've heard a hermit say this in India and in the States, say, if I was to go live in a big house, if I was to go live in a monastery, or live in a city, I wouldn't get the accomplishments that I had. I have to be a hermit for it to even work. So again, then furthermore, you have the temple versus the hermitage. So, you know, do you go to a temple to worship, or do you go out into wilderness and, you know, build your own little temple and do your own thing there? Apophatic versus cataphatic. You'll see this idea, apophatic, remember, the blank vision, not this, not this, not this, till you have an experience of divinity, versus cataphatic, whereas they describe that experience and you try to get there on your own. And then finally, interior, exterior gods. What does it mean that you can find all these gods in the body? What does that mean? Versus out there. Also, I want you to think about alchemy. So remember alchemy, making lead into gold through manipulating physical substances, or consuming physical substances and transmuting them in your own body, inner versus outer alchemy. So these are some of the themes that I want you to think about regarding religion in general. And that's the nature of that there tune. So go enjoy yourself. Have a good one. I'll see you later.